In January 1945, on a cold railway platform at the entrance to one of Nazi Germany's most feared concentration camps, a father made a desperate split-second decision. He grabbed a large cloth sack, the same sack he used to carry his leather crafting tools, stuffed his tiny son inside it, and prayed that the child would stay silent. That child's name was Joseph Schlagsteigen. The world would later know him as Joseph Schleifstein. And his story, a story of impossible survival, a father's love, and the darkest chapter in human history, is one that almost no one ever heard, until now. Joseph Schlagsteigen was born on March 7, 1941, in Sandomierz, Poland, a small town already living under the iron boot of Nazi occupation. His parents, Israel and Esther Schlagsteigen, were Jewish, and by the time Joseph drew his first breath, the world around him was already closing in. Within months of his birth, the Nazi regime began systematically rounding up Jewish communities across occupied Poland, herding them into walled-off sections of cities called ghettos, overcrowded, undersupplied, and cut off from the outside world. The Schleifstein family was forced into the Jewish ghetto outside Sandomierz, where they lived in constant fear and uncertainty. That ghetto was evacuated in June 1942, when Joseph was barely 15 months old. The family was relocated to the Czesztowa ghetto, where Israel was put to work in the HASAG factory, a German munitions manufacturer that used Jewish forced laborers to supply the Nazi war machine. In the ghettos, children Joseph's age were in constant danger. Nazi doctrine classified children too young to work as useless mouths, a cold bureaucratic phrase that meant death. Guards would routinely sweep through ghettos and drag small children away, sending them to be murdered in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. To survive, Joseph's parents hid him in cellars in corners, in the dark spaces that adults could squeeze into and children could disappear inside. Those early memories of being hidden in the dark would mark Joseph for the rest of his life. Decades later, he would still suffer from what he described as terrible nightmares, a recurring dream of a massive boot descending toward him, about to crush him, waking him screaming in the night. He developed a lifelong fear of death and a deep, unshakable aversion to darkness. But even hiding in ghettos would not protect the Schleifstein family forever. In 1943, the Nazi regime tightened its grip. The family was deported, loaded onto a train with hundreds of other Jewish prisoners, and transported deep into Germany toward a place called Buchenwald. Buchenwald, even the name carries weight. Established in July 1937 on the Ettersberg Hill near the city of Weimar, a city known as the birthplace of German classical culture, the concentration camp was a monument to human cruelty. It was one of the first major camps built within Germany's own borders, and by the time the Schleifsteins arrived, it had become one of the largest and most feared in the entire Nazi system. Over the course of its existence, more than 280,000 people from at least 30 countries passed through its gates. Forced to labor in 12-hour shifts in armaments factories and stone quarries, prisoners were subjected to starvation, disease, beatings, and deliberate execution. At least 56,000 people died at Buchenwald, killed by the conditions, by the guards, or by SS doctors who carried out gruesome medical experiments on living human beings, testing vaccines, poisons, and infectious diseases on prisoners with no regard for their survival. There were no gas chambers at Buchenwald, but there was a crematorium. There was a punishment block where prisoners were tortured to death. There was a stable where a special SS unit called Commando 99 shot thousands of Soviet prisoners of war through a narrow slit in the wall while they underwent what they were told was a routine medical examination. The camp was a machine built to destroy human beings. And it was into this machine that Israel Schleifstein brought his 2.5-year-old son. When their transport arrived at the Buchenwald railhead, the prisoners were sorted with terrifying efficiency. The strong, the young, the able-bodied were sent to the right, to slave labor, to suffering, but to the possibility of life. The old, the sick, the very young, children like Joseph were sent to the left. Those sent to the left were to be murdered immediately. Joseph was sent to the left. What happened next would define the rest of his life. In the confusion of the selection process, the shouting, the chaos, the crowd of hundreds of terrified people, Israel Schleifstein spotted a large cloth sack among his belongings. The same sack he used to carry his leatherworking tools. Without hesitation, he grabbed his son, pressed a stern finger to the boy's lips, warned him with every ounce of fatherly authority he possessed to make absolutely no sound, and pushed Joseph inside. The sack, stuffed with leather tools and clothing, looked unremarkable. The guards did not check it. Joseph Schleifstein was smuggled into Buchenwald concentration camp at 2.5 years old, hidden inside a bag. His mother, Esther, was sent in a different direction to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Joseph would not see her again for years. The people sent to the left that day, everyone who had lined up where Joseph had stood just minutes before, were all murdered. Inside Buchenwald, hiding a child was not something a single man could do alone. Israel Schleifstein relied on the help of fellow prisoners, including 2 anti-fascist German inmates who risked their own lives to keep the boy concealed. But a toddler in a concentration camp cannot stay hidden forever. Eventually, the SS guards discovered the child. What happened next was perhaps the strangest twist in an already extraordinary story. Instead of executing Joseph on the spot, the guards made him something remarkable: a camp mascot. It was a depraved kind of affection. The men who oversaw a camp where tens of thousands of people were worked to death and executed found themselves charmed by this small Polish boy with dark eyes and a quiet disposition. They had a tiny, child-sized striped uniform made for him, the same kind of uniform all Buchenwald prisoners wore, and they began bringing him to the daily morning roll calls. Each morning, with thousands of emaciated prisoners standing at attention, little Joseph Schlagsteigen, dressed in his small, striped uniform, would stand before the assembled guards, raise his hand in a salute and report in a child's voice. All prisoners accounted for. The guards laughed. For them, it was entertainment. For the prisoners who watched in silence, it was something far more complicated: the sight of a stolen childhood being made into a performance. But even this twisted protection had its limits. When senior Nazi officials arrived at the camp for formal inspections, Joseph had to be hidden again. The upper ranks of the SS could not be allowed to see a Jewish child living openly within the camp. Israel would scramble to conceal his son behind boards, beneath bunks, inside walls of stacked belongings. On at least one of those occasions, things went catastrophically wrong. Joseph later recalled being lined up for execution, caught out, exposed, standing among prisoners waiting to die. It was his father who intervened at the final moment, pleading for Joseph's life on the strength of Israel's own value to the camp. Israel Schleifstein was a skilled leather worker. He made saddles and harnesses for the SS, and his usefulness as a craftsman gave him just enough leverage to pull his son back from the edge. Joseph also fell gravely ill during his time in the camp and spent a period recovering in the camp hospital, a place that for most prisoners was as much a site of danger as of healing, where SS doctors were known to kill inmates they deemed beyond recovery. That Joseph survived all of it: the executions he was nearly part of, the illness, the inspections, the daily grinding horror of life inside Buchenwald, remains, by any measure, one of the most remarkable stories to emerge from the entire Holocaust. By early April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing around the Nazi regime. The Allied armies were closing in from both sides, and the SS at Buchenwald began forcing tens of thousands of prisoners out on death marches, sending them away from the approaching Americans. More than 28,000 prisoners were evacuated in early April alone. Thousands died on those marches, shot when they fell or killed by exhaustion and starvation. But Joseph and his father were still in the camp when it happened. On the morning of April 11, 1945, armored divisions of the 3rd U.S. Army advanced toward Buchenwald. The SS guards, rather than face the Americans, abandoned their posts and fled. Prisoners took control of the watchtowers, and at approximately 3 in the afternoon, American soldiers drove through the gates of Buchenwald. They found more than 21,000 people still inside, including nearly 1,000 children and teenagers, among them a 4-year-old boy named Joseph Schlagsteigen. The soldiers who liberated Buchenwald were not prepared for what they found. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces, visited the nearby subcamp of Ohrdruf shortly afterward and insisted on documenting every horror in detail so that no one could ever deny what had happened there. CBS reporter Edward R. Murrow broadcast a now-famous radio report from Buchenwald describing men and boys reaching out to touch the American soldiers with skeletal hands, smiling with their eyes even as death had already claimed most of their bodies. Joseph Schlagsteigen remembered the day of liberation for 3 reasons. First, he no longer had to hide. Second, he suddenly had plenty to eat and drink. And third, the American soldiers gave him rides on their tanks and jeeps, which he described, even decades later, with the uncomplicated delight of a small child who had somehow held on to a piece of himself through everything. The famous photograph was taken in those days after liberation. A small boy sitting on the running board of a United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration truck, wearing clothes fashioned from a German soldier's uniform because there was nothing else for the children to wear. That photograph of Joseph Schlagsteigen became one of the most enduring images of the Holocaust survivors. After liberation, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee arranged for Joseph and his father to receive medical treatment in Switzerland. Then they returned to Germany, to the town of Dachau, to search for Esther. Against extraordinary odds, she had survived Bergen-Belsen. The family was reunited. In 1947, Joseph Schleifstein, a 6-year-old child, stood before an American military tribunal in Dachau and served as a prosecution witness in the Buchenwald camp trial. The trial charged 31 former guards and camp officials with crimes committed at Buchenwald. Joseph was called a star witness. Of those 31 defendants, 22 were sentenced to death. The rest received prison terms. In 1948, the Schleifstein family immigrated to the United States, settling in Brooklyn with the help of the JDC. Israel Schleifstein joined the Jewish community in Brooklyn, where Joseph grew up, went to school, and built a life. A younger brother, Benjamin, was born in 1950. Israel died in 1956. Esther lived until 1997. Joseph worked at AT&T for 25 years before retiring. He raised 2 children of his own, a daughter named Karen and a son named Ira. And for decades he told none of them what had happened to him, not a word, not a hint. The Holocaust was a silence that many survivors carried, a weight so enormous that speaking it out loud felt impossible. Joseph himself later explained it plainly. He feared the stigma, feared being seen as damaged goods, feared carrying the visible marks of what the Nazis had done into a new life that was supposed to be free. The silence lasted more than 50 years. It was broken almost by accident in 1999, when the Italian film Life is Beautiful, Roberto Benigni's Academy Award-winning story of a father who hides his son inside a Nazi concentration camp, was re-examined on its 2nd anniversary. A researcher at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee came across old archival records about a real boy, a real father, a real sack. A search began. After a month of following leads, researchers from the Jewish Week found Joseph Schleifstein living in New York City. He was 58 years old. When he sat down to talk about what had happened to him for the first time publicly in his entire life, he said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. He said, "I think that hate destroys the hater. What the Germans did was awful, but you have to go on. You can't let it taint the next generation. Looking to the future means forgiveness." Joseph Schleifstein was 2.5 years old when his father stuffed him into a sack and smuggled him into Buchenwald concentration camp. He was 4 years old when American soldiers found him sitting on a truck in the ruins of that same camp, small and alive and blinking in the spring light. He survived a selection line where everyone around him was killed. He survived being hidden, being discovered, being made into a prop for the amusement of his captors. He survived being lined up for execution. He survived disease, starvation, and one of the most brutal institutions in the history of the modern world. And then, for 50 years, he survived the silence, carrying all of it alone. Joseph Schleifstein's story is not just a story of survival. It is a story of what one parent will do for a child. Of what ordinary people, even in the depths of hell, will risk for another human being. Of the strange, stubborn, inexplicable will of a small boy to simply stay alive. The Holocaust claimed the lives of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. More than 1 million of those victims were children, plucked from their homes, stripped of their futures, murdered because of who they were born to be. Joseph Schleifstein was one of the ones who lived, and now, finally, you know his name. If this story moved you, if you believe these stories must be told, remembered, and passed on, then subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell. Every week, we bring you the verified, deeply researched human stories that history books leave out. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because the only way these stories survive is if we keep telling them.